Hello, students. This is Mr. Martiron with your Chapter 9's nominations and campaign notes. You want to have out the note packet that I gave you guys that outlines the chapter and just follow along as I go through the notes. The reason for this, we just came through a very vigorous election cycle, so I don't want to belabor the point too much since we actually lived it. But the road to the nomination, so a couple things to discuss. A nomination is not automatic. It's usually a grueling fight that begins many, many months before the nomination campaign. Usually, candidates will start feeling around about 2 years into a presidential term. So for us, we're at the start of a new presidency, but not until after the midterms in 2020 will potential candidates, begin to feel around to see what the mood of the country is like. And quite honestly, if the Republicans do well in 2020 and President Trump is polling very high and has a very strong favorability, that may scare off many potential Democrats. And they may turn to someone who is a weaker candidate that can be sacrificed. For example, in 1998, going into that election cycle, Bill Clinton was his numbers were looking very strong, and the Republicans didn't have a strong candidate that could challenge him. But the road to the nomination begins about 2 years before an election cycle. But the nomination is when that primary season comes to an end and the party gets behind a candidate and officially endorses him or her. All right, a campaign strategy, you have to have a good campaign team in place that usually costs millions of dollars, which is why there's the constant need to fundraise. And these candidates, lay out their electoral endgame. For certain states, because of the electoral math, it's not wise for them to compete there. For example, there was no chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, so she really didn't spend any money or time there. Now, what does that mean for down ticket candidates? Well, that's a struggle because usually in a presidential election year, you want to have the top of the ticket support because you're going to have higher turnout in a presidential election year than you will any of the other election cycles. All right, so first of all, you have to decide to run. And we said that the campaigns are physically taxing and they are longer and more emotionally draining than ever before, especially with the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, you're constantly on the go, and things have evolved into the constant campaign. Senator Obama announced his candidacy in January of 2007, which enabled him all of 2007 and most of 2008 to run money, build an organization, raise money and build an organization for his 2008 campaigns. Most countries, believe it or not, it's required by law that that the campaign season is only between a certain time of the year, which is very interesting. The United States does not have that. So therefore, candidates can theoretically begin running at any point. A candidate tomorrow could decide that he wants to run for president and make his intentions known. But as we said, politicians run for things, and that is their goal. So you'll see a lot of people kind of maneuvering, trying to get their name out there. For example, two senators made some prominent news during these confirmation hearings. Number one was Marco Rubio during the during the Senate confirmation on Rex Tillerson. He was very critical of the Secretary of State, then the nominee. Marco Rubio made some comments which got him some good press and good favorability. Perhaps he's positioning himself if the Trump presidency implodes. A Democratic senator that made some waves is Cory Booker. Again, grabbing the spotlight, maybe grandstanding, but maybe keeping his name out there if he decides to run in 2020. All right, the big game of the primary season is competing for delegates. All right. What you want to do is, beginning with these primaries and these caucuses, is you want to knock out your opponents. So, for example, the Republican field, there were many candidates, and you didn't have to be number one, you just didn't have to finish last. So coming out of Iowa, Donald Trump winning the caucus there had momentum going into New Hampshire. And after New Hampshire, it was quite apparent that Governor Christie didn't have any momentum, and his money was drying up, so he dropped out. So now people that would typically support another would be supporting Christie. Now they're throwing their support to other candidates. Most of that support, believe it or not, went to Donald Trump. So Trump was able to build and capitalize on that momentum going forward. The conventions today, it's important to know, very rarely is there a contested convention. That was one of the big the media stories that they were trying to drum up this summer was, will the Bernie Sanders people try and take the nomination away from Clinton, or will the mainstream Republicans try and take the nomination away from Donald Trump? It didn't happen, but that was always good speculation on their part. All right. So as I just said, competing for delegates, you've got the road to the primary beginning in the 20th century. The primary season really became the battleground, the way to the nomination. Um, the McGovern-Fraser Commission, I would make sure you commit that to knowledge, um, really revamped how Democrats select their primaries and their delegates. And that also gives rise to the superdelegates. Um, and these are superdelegates, as we said in class, they're the only in the Democratic Party, and these are leaders who automatically get a delegate spot. So a governor, a congressman, they get to be delegates automatically. Um, the more important problem with the primary is the idea of front loading. Okay, we know that the first caucus is always Iowa and then New Hampshire, but a lot of people say, well, that's not very indicative of the country itself. Iowa, 90% white, New Hampshire, 92% white. It's not very indicative of a growing, diverse America. So a lot of states are trying to move their primaries up, and that causes some friction within the parties itself. The other problem you have is, by the time the New Jersey primary was held in June or other primaries later in May, the nominee may already have their delegates locked up. So as far as competing for primary, some of the problems that we'll finish up. There's disproportionate attention. I mean, Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada are the four states that get the most attention because that's, they're the first four to go. Um, Many prominent politicians don't play a role in the early primary season. They choose not to run. The primaries are usually for good grassroots organizers. For example, Barack Obama in 2007. He was a first-term senator. He didn't have the money right away, so he had to really put a lot of time and stake into Iowa, as did Governor Jimmy Carter. Again, Carter didn't have a whole lot of name recognition, but he put all of his stake in Iowa. Money plays a big role too in competing for delegates. If you're not fundraising, if you don't have the money rolling in for a long primary season, you're not going to last. And we saw that in the Republican field. As these guys started losing primaries, it became obvious that they weren't going to be true contenders, and people weren't giving money, and and then that dries up. Participation in primaries is usually historically low. About 20% of the electorate usually comes out and votes in the primary. Most people believe it's a foregone conclusion. All right. As far as the convention, and this is where I'll wrap video one up. The convention send-off. This is the big moment. The convention is the point where the party comes together. So as far as the nomination and the convention send-off goes, conventions have played a huge part of kind of the drama of the campaign. Um, the networks used to cover 4 days of conventioneering, but now it's become kind of almost routine. So what the networks do is they'll reserve like 8 nights, four for the Democrats, four for the Republicans, and they'll only show really the prime time, maybe 2 to 4 hours of programming, maybe even the keynote speaker. You're more likely to find day-to-day, hour-by-hour convention on the cable news networks. What the big thing for the convention is the party platform and the statement of the party goals. So that's going to be interesting. The convention does not meet every year. They don't meet annually. They meet every 4 years. And that's really important. A lot of people think that every year the Republican and Democratic parties are allowed to kind of reinvent themselves. That only happens every 4 years. And usually the platform's debated on the second day of the convention. And then once you have the platform, you formally nominate your president and or your candidate for president and vice president. As far as the media goes, because we've been talking a lot about that in this unit, coverage beginning in 1956, when it was at its peak, or even really 1964, the Democratic convention was actually held in Atlantic City. The convention's just coverage has declined. Just people aren't interested in 4-hour infomercial. So the networks, it's a hard time. It's a hard sell for a lot of the business people that own the news networks. Why are they going to air something that they know people aren't going to watch? So we'll hold up there. In the next video, we'll talk about life after the convention and the road to the White House.